So Nunkri Nungi, everyone. Napi Pudri Maori Pomerunk, Nana Jerry Rui. My name's Paul Worley. I'm Executive Director of Clinical Innovation here at Murray Bridge on Nana country in South Australia. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to our race grand round, an opportunity for the Academy to hear from experts around the world, to engage, to learn, to listen, and to find how this applies to us and how we might be able to work with people around the world to advance medicine. You'll often hear people talk about you need to grow where you're planted. Now, that's okay if you, as a community, happen to be in a place where doctors and nurses and others are growing and naturally exist. But what about those places and those events that happen without healthcare being available, and where we also have that obligation to get out of our comfort zone and learn what we need to know in order to be able to care for people in extreme environments where it's not natural to grow your own workforce. We're lucky today to have an expert in this area, someone who has worked across the world and been recognised as a leader globally in extreme medicine, Professor Mark Hannaford. And you'll see from his title that there is a social accountability aspect to what is can otherwise be seen as a fabulous adventure. So we're looking forward very much to hearing your presentation, and then the opportunity for us to have some questions afterwards. Over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to join your lunch break. It's my breakfast. I'm in Abu Dhabi at the moment. I'm working from a hotel room, so I've got, rather than share my boring hotel room background, I've got sort of a backdrop. But consequently, I'm working from my laptop, so I can't see you. So if I look slightly inane at times, it's because I'm looking at my slides rather than looking at your lovely faces. So just by way of just context, my background is non-clinical. I've been involved in sort of expeditions and remote travel and low resource environments for the last 30 years. And in kind of expedition, and more recently in the last 15 years, extreme medicine. So as you can see from the slide, I've set up the MSc in extreme medicine at the University of Exeter, and also a postgraduate program at Boover College of Health Sciences, which is part of Northeastern University in Boston. And also a couple of years ago, after the invasion of Ukraine, set up I guess an NGO. Well, we're a company acting as an NGO called Medics for Ukraine, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. 20 minutes. I'm not used to talking for quite such a short time, but that's quite a good discipline for me. So I'm going to hopefully entertain you, but also open your eyes to some of the opportunities that are there for you. And I think perhaps sort of debunk the impression that extreme medicine is about grand adventures, which of course that's part of it, but also there's a lot more to that in terms of disaster humanitarian response. In Australia, you've got a really, really well-developed system, and I almost feel sometimes, what can we, add to that mix? And I think it's that international context. It's that sort of working in far from home in low resource environments, and how you deal with that both on a clinical aspect, but also personally. So just to sort of enliven your lunchtime, I've got a little bit of video. Hopefully the sound will play your end too. So hopefully this is going to work. I had a bit of a sec.
Tens of thousands homeless, and many more still unaccounted for tonight after the worst disaster.
It's the worst disaster ever on the mountain.
Get it! Sniper!
Everybody's got to be ready from now on. I mean, you never know what's going to happen from now on. and now out of control in West Africa.
Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone are the countries
where nearly
most
600 cases of Ebola have been confirmed in Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia.
It's important to respond quickly. Just a few hours can make all the difference.
So hopefully that gives you a kind of picture of the broad scope of where, you know, our engagement in terms of what we do in terms of training, but also deployments overseas and stuff. It's becoming, you know, a recognized subdiscipline of medicine, and one which can be a career. People generally use it as a sort of adjunct to their main clinical careers, and we would strongly suggest that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that actually doing this type of medicine, taking yourself away from your normal system, seeing new systems and challenging yourself, actually contributes positively to your main clinical career. You know, why do we do it? There's some evidence that a particular gene which is present within 20% of the population, and I suspect a number of you sitting in the room at the moment will start to sort of think, well, I think I might be part of that trait. You know, and that 20% that gives us that risk-taking personalities, more extreme than others and some people, but also, you know, the desire to travel to far horizons. And I think as a human species, that's been incredibly important in, you know, our sort of evolution and our life here on the planet. Perhaps we're taking that a little bit too far at the moment, but we're almost driven to do this. So of 20% of the population, you know, and 80%, which is the way you want society, isn't it? You want 80% actually being stable, but you want 20% going off there to explore and find new horizon, new resources. And if this is something that you might be, you think you might have, there's quite a lot of reasonable papers that show that risk-taking amongst certain societies is extremely beneficial. So there's lots of papers out there that you can research and stuff, do you know, and it sort of gave that kind of Victorian colonial, and I hate that using that word, but that kind of, you know, that desire to explore and find new territories at almost any cost. So the risk gene is what it's called. Commonly, the explorer's gene is a sort of another name that people have given to that, and it's essentially a sort of low tolerance to, or high tolerance to dopamine, and the need to excite yourself more in order to trigger that dopamine response. You know, and it gives you wanderlust. There's some positives and negatives to this. It's closely associated with ADHD, with certain other behavior traits that might not be quite so positive. But you can see that it's you know, it gives you that desire to live a life less ordinary. And I suspect there are lots of you, actually, I have to go through this again. Lots of you in the room for whom this will trigger. Sorry. But it also has a negative side, of course, that when you're constrained by society or social norms, it can actually make you really quite unhappy. And for those of you driven to this, you need to get that balance. And extreme medicine for clinicians is one of those very definite avenues. But it's driven society as a whole, of course. You know, that desire to explore, you know, that one small step for mankind, humankind, but also, you know, a giant leap for us all. It's led society has got behind that 20% of the population that need to travel and need to explore to enable that. When I started working in expeditions, this field was typically called expedition medicine, or if you're in the States, wilderness medicine. And that's where we concentrated on preparing medical professionals. 20, 30 years ago, that was primarily doctors. That's changed now to sort of doctors, paramedics, and nurses. And we trained people to work in expeditions, and at that sort of stage, it was primarily mountain medicine which came to the fore. But actually, our expeditions were in jungle environments, desert environments. They were on the sea. They were everywhere. So, we very much sort of expanded the field, I think, and sort of joined it in one place. But we realized actually there was a much bigger thing here, in so much as we were attracting sort of medical professionals from special forces medicine, from humanitarian medicine, people who are responding to disasters, people working in pre-hospital care. And those areas tended to be quite siloed. And we wanted to build a community or a discipline that actually joined and provided a community of sharing, whether that was sharing experience, whether that's generating new research, or generating opportunities. So if you were a military medic but wanted to work in a humanitarian setting, there was a clear pathway and a way in which you could make contacts. So we kind of draw on lots of different areas to try and make medicine in low resource environments better, and to break down silos and open up collaboration. But we very much stand on the shoulders of giants, really. So, the frostbite, cold weather injuries, which is probably not something that you come across too much in Australia unless you're working on the Antarctic program. A lot of that science comes from the military. So on the French retreat from Moscow, it was noticed that the officers were tending to get much worse frostbite and cold tissue injuries than the enlisted soldiers. And Dominic Larry, the Surgeon General for the French Army, realized that actually the soldiers who were enlisted and therefore further from the evening fire, because it was the officers that sat round the fire warming their hands and their feet, suffered less. And they realized that the officers sitting by the fire were constantly thawing, and why that would be your instinct, kind of constantly thawing their cold injuries, but it was increasing their tissue damage. Whereas the enlisted soldiers pushed to the outside of the fire, their injuries stayed frozen and therefore had less cold weather injuries. He also he realized Napoleon was able to move and one of his strategic sort of assets was to move his artillery extremely quickly around the battlefield. And Dominic Larry realized that if he took the artillery piece off and put wounded soldiers on them and took them to an aid post, he could potentially return them to the battle more quickly, but also increase the survivability rate. So, he stripped the artillery pieces of their artillery and instead turned them into the first ambulances, certainly battlefield ambulances. And I spoke to a military historian, Emily Mayhew, at Imperial University in the UK, and we were asking why in Europe paramedicine is less developed than it is in Australia, in the UK. And she posited that actually that was due to the fact that Australians and UK Army, or British soldiers during the First World War, had to extract or return their wounded soldiers to the UK, and then obviously back to Australia. And in order to increase survivability and to be able to treat people, the stretcher bearers were treating people en route, providing basic care, providing basic sort of wound care, whereas the European armies were returning taking their casualties to their nearest hospital. So their journey was much shorter. So the need for care along the route was lessened. And she posited that's why paramedicine is so much more developed in the UK, Australia, and the US than it is or has been in Europe. And my sort of epiphany, my sort of turning point, was crossing a river in the border between Angola and Namibia. We were doing a site visit for an expedition that we were doing. We had more time than we would normally have. Normally these trips are quite rushed because you're trying to pack in as much time as possible into a shorter period. This time we had excess time, and idle hands, what does it make? What's that expression? Idle hands make trouble. I can't remember the exact expression. We would camp early and then decide on a challenge. The people I was traveling with had fought in the war with the guerrillas who were based in Angola. the freedom fighters, depending on your viewpoint, and had crossed the Canina River a number of times sort of during those operations. And they wanted to do a trip down memory lane, and relying on the fact that these guys were expert, they were Namibian, they knew the country. There was a big waterfall downstream. There were big rapids upstream. Now I'm talking to Australians who are very, I would imagine, crocodile aware. They said it's perfectly safe because we've got rapids upstream, we've got big waterfall downstream. There's going to be no crocodiles here. So we set off swimming across this a couple of 100 meters, brown, limpid, slowly moving river with a rock 3/4 the way across. But it was still flowing strongly enough that we needed to sort of consider sort of a bit of water safety. So we went in upstream, swam parallel to the river, gradually drifted downstream to this rock, which we were going to rest on, and then regroup and go into Angola. 10 meters from the rock, it stood up on sort of reptilian armored legs, looked at us disdainfully, and slid slowly into the water. And the rock, which previously had been big enough for 3 grown men, was now big enough for 3 of us to hold on to each other and ponder our next move. Clearly, actually, what we had to do was do the remaining easy stretch to get into Angola. But we had to return, and we were literally in the middle of nowhere. And I was with 2 people who, you know, would be of interest to the local authorities if they were to find them there, because clearly we swam across the river. We didn't have passports. It was an unofficial visit, and swimming back was something of a more strained event. So swimming back, swimming from the other direction made me realize actually this is quite clearly crocodile country, because you could see the bank and just the signs of it. And actually, that's where trouble almost arrived. Not so much, well, there were certainly crocodiles in the water, but it was that sense of appreciating the danger and starting to panic and being in deep water. And it was a case of actually getting ourselves together, thinking, okay, well, we could be attacked by crocodiles, but our risk at the moment is actually is our human factors, is our teamwork, is getting us out. We've got to manage that. We can't control the bits that we can't control. We can only control the bits that we can control, and just focusing on that. As I've mentioned, looking at time, with the invasion of Ukraine, we felt, given our sort of unique network and skill set, that we couldn't sit idly by. And so we focused very clearly on providing trauma training to the medical community in Ukraine who weren't otherwise trained in that, or people that had been conscripted into the army as medics. And we wanted to not only provide trauma training, but also deliver medical supplies. So we, a couple of weeks after the invasion, set up Medics for Ukraine. And in the process, we've delivered 6 million Australian dollars worth of supplies. We set off with an initial aim of delivering £100,000, and I can't quite remember what that translates to in Australian dollars. Obviously, we've gone quite a long way past that, and we've trained 800 sort of special operations, but also more importantly, civil defence and medical professionals in TCCC, so tactical combat casualty care. And I'd say this not to sort of blow our own trumpet, but it's more to show that if you set out with a defined aim and with energy and commitment, you know, people will come to and support you. People will follow you. So, and as medical professionals, you'll often find causes like this, and I'm sure in your career, where you feel that you can make a real difference. And I would suggest that you do make a real difference, and sort of enlist your skills, enlist your network and your friends to deliver, change. And I put to remind myself why the offer, because actually you wouldn't normally do this training inside, but because we're training here in Kherson, which, as you know, is quite close to the border, there are also people who drive around and will text unfriendly forces to say there are groups of military people training here. Please send them an airborne presence. So by doing it in offices, of course, we're out of view. But these, you know, we didn't set out to train the army, but everybody on that front is army, and these are young men and women who have they're chefs, they're drivers, they're all sorts, they're doctors. these are people who've been forced into conflict. So we wanted to give them the skills to keep themselves and their colleagues alive. So our next convoy goes in a couple of weeks. We've had one last week, and our next training team goes in a few weeks too. But it's not without risk. We don't do deliveries. We get the supplies and then they're delivered by our volunteers. But obviously, it's not without risk, as this vehicle sort of highlights. But we're giving them knowledge and information, which is really useful. But I also think what's really important, and I think this is, a message that's worth taking on board, is that they feel like they're being supported, that they're not being left, that we do care, and that people will go and support them. And I think that's as important message as actually the training and the supplies that we do deliver. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip through this a little bit. So if that gene is in your body but you're attracted to this type of medicine, there are lots of opportunities out there, and the lots of opportunities are actually paid as well. I think there's a truism that this is holiday, that you give up salary to do this. It's an emerging field, and there are a number of jobs out there that are actually relatively well paid, and you don't have to sacrifice sort of income to do them. Of course, going on expeditions and stuff like that, generally you'll be doing them for free. But just to highlight, there are paid jobs out there. Let me just skip through this a little bit. And we just started to offer courses which are accredited by ACRM, and they're on our website, both at the moment in South Australia, but we'll be doing others around Australia too. And there is an annual conference that we run, which is called the World Extreme or the FEWM conference, which happens in November in Edinburgh. And I've looked just turn off my timer. And I think when you're looking at this and against your aspirations, this is one of my sort of mantras, I guess, that it always seems impossible until it's done. So it's a case of taking small steps. It's a case of, if this is what you're interested in, meeting people, going on courses, going to conference, getting into the community. It's one of those communities where people are there to share, and they want to help you take your own voyage as people have helped them in the past.
Hello, and welcome to the 2023 Extreme Medicine Conference. I'm Dr. Frank Rubio, a NASA astronaut, former Army flight surgeon, and also a former Black Hawk helicopter pilot. It is my pleasure to greet you from on board the International Space Station and kick off this amazing conference with you. Human spaceflight challenges us every day, from the inhospitable vacuum of space to the microgravity-induced adaptive changes we see in our bodies. This is an extremely challenging environment. Yet, we've been operating here continuously for the past 23 years. This is why the concepts of extreme medicine and pushing boundaries are essential to us. Preparation for spaceflight is challenging, but rewarding. For instance, the Neutral Buoyancy Lab allows us to practice our spacewalks. Flying the T-38 supersonic jet lets us practice our crew coordination and communication in a dynamic and high-stakes setting. Aquatic and wilderness expeditions like Nemo and NOLS provide situations that closely resemble the challenges of team living in space. And mountain and caving experiences expose us to rugged terrains that mimic the lunar landscapes we hope to explore once again in the near future. Of course, non-technical skills are equally as important. Leadership, decision-making, communication, and team cohesion are indispensable competencies, and we use every opportunity to improve upon those skills. Deliberate training that facilitates high-performing teams is crucial, and you can see that we seek it out continuously so that we can better prepare for pushing boundaries into the unknown. One thing that we do know is that every incredible journey begins with one small step. If you are an early career extreme medicine professional, I urge you to make the most of the fantastic speakers and workshops available to you this week. Finally, we salute every extreme professional already pushing the boundaries of your field. Thank you for what you do. Gatherings like this, where ideas flow, opportunities abound, and new connections are made, help us push science and medicine to new levels. So, best of luck, take care, and enjoy the conference.
So it was a bit of a gallop through extreme medicine, and I hope that goes down. I know the last bit sounds like a bit of a plug for the conference. It's not meant to be, but Frank puts it so eloquently and you know, presents to you the opportunities that are there so eloquently that I could not share that video.
Mark, thank you so much. Please stop sharing. I'm seeing myself far too big in that.
Oh, hang on. Website. Let me just, as I said, I hardly ever use Teams now. There we go. I think that's me. Stop sharing.
Yes, yeah, fantastic. So you said you would talk about a life less ordinary. One of the things about a life less ordinary is that it's good to leave people wanting more. People with that 7R allele are probably people who often are left wanting more, and I think you've done that with us today. And one of the questions we do have just a couple of minutes. One of my questions is you clearly you talked about the fact of controlling the things you can control, and you talked about the human factors and the team factors. What about the physiology that you're having to deal with? You know, when you're in extreme environments and with traumatic environments, is there a lot of new physiology that you have to deal with, or is that actually simpler than you may fear as a person who hasn't been in that environment?
I think to be honest, preparing yourself is useful. So going on courses, going on into environments that are not dissimilar to what you might be going into helps you to prepare. It's never going to completely compare, but it sort of gets your muscle memory working. I think also we use the word extreme because I guess we come from that type of environment. But however, if you imagine you're working in a humanitarian setting, you might well be working in a refugee camp, where the physical challenge of that is much less than perhaps working at Everest. However, the mental challenge is significantly more. So I think when people think, and this is perhaps a misnaming, but people think of our field, they think about climbing mountains, but actually that's just such a small part of it. It's about that disaster humanitarian response, which I'm really passionate about because I think that delivers most benefit. And the challenges are very different, and it is worth preparing yourself for that, because not everything is going to go your way, and your security will at times be compromised, and you need to be cognizant of those elements of that. So there's a physical preparation, but also very much a mental preparation too.
Thank you so much for whetting our appetite, I think. And I think you're right. There's a group of researchers who talk about clinical courage being one of the hallmarks of rural generalism. And rural generalism is a branch of medicine, nursing, and allied health practice that we champion very much here in the Riverland Academy. So it's not surprising that a number of people who are interested in rural generalism are also interested in extreme medicine and interested in humanitarian medicine and serving in those areas of great need. Thank you so much for your presentation today. If people want to know more, how do they find you, and how do they find out more about this?
Well, and thank you for the opportunity. So World Extreme Medicine is a company I set up. So there's obviously a website, type in extreme medicine, but also personally, I spend quite a lot of my time, as I'm sure you do, Paul, is signposting for people and talking through what they want to achieve, and then perhaps aiding them. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram. All of those places I respond to, and actually probably more than email, just because they're so much more convenient. And I'm more than happy rather to provide introductions and to talk people through. People come into this field, often they want to do the expedition and then realize actually it's humanitarian they want to do, and vice versa. So, and of course, everybody can do all of it. They don't have to limit themselves.
That's fabulous. And for those people who didn't recognize a name in one of Mark's slides. Dr. Richie Madden is actually part of the Riverland Academy, working at Murray Bridge at the moment. And he is an Australian representative and leader in WEM. So if you want to talk face to face to somebody, Richie would be a good person to talk to. And no, he didn't go on Ernest Shackleton's expedition. He's much easier to get hold of than Ernest is. Wayne, you've got a comment?
Yeah, really. So great presentation, Mark. Very compelling, very interesting. I was just going to comment because we've got our own race emergency management conference coming up on the 1st and 2nd of June. And some of that will include elements of expedition type medicine in terms of what to do when health systems overrun, using some of the examples from when I led the earthquake response in Christchurch. So a great chance to also connect people that have got an interest up with what might be available very locally, as well as connecting them through to Mark as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Wayne. And as Wayne intimated, he has a experience of working in extreme conditions, post-earthquake, post-fires, and of course we've all had a touch of that in the pandemic, with the unknown and uncertainty that confronted us as we went through that. So yes, please think about that emergency conference that the Academy is running, and think about where humanity is and where medicine must follow. And some of those environments are extreme and require us to do that additional training. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this grand round. As I say, clinical courage, a hallmark of rural generalism, and clearly a hallmark of those clinicians who see extreme medicine as part of their toolkit, as part of their career, as part of their contribution to humanity. Nakan, and we'll see you at our next grand round.